Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature I'm majoring for it, and we are here for a video that will be in the book tour playlist here on the channel, but it will also be part of a two-channel event here through September, where I humbly turned 35 years of age, but every bit as handsome as I ever was, and I am going to be posting a video every day through the month of September here on Strip Cover Lit, but also on my personal channel, and you can find a pinned comment in the comment section below that will take you directly to that personal channel. Just click on the little icon that has my face in it down there, and it'll take you over there. And over there, I talk about movies. I talk about a little bit about philosophy and things like that. I will have non-fiction read-alongs. So some of the books here are supposed to appear on that channel at some point in the future. I don't really have a whole lot of direction for that channel, really, necessarily at this point, but I am I'm slowly building a catalog of videos for things, slowly building several different playlists for things. One of the things that I'll be doing over there is movie reviews. Another, like I say, is nonfiction read-alongs. Another is a little bit of philosophy stuff, a little bit of workout stuff, things like that. But that is what I do over there. Over here, I will be doing book reviews, poetry reviews, short story reviews. You cockeyed? What is going on here? This thing never sets up straight. That did nothing. Anyway, but I thought I would start doing a little bit of a bookshelf tour, because I've never really done any of that before, and I might want to show off some stuff, because I don't do a whole lot of book hauls. So there's not a whole lot of general content that happens on this channel. Most of everything is actually specific to a text, which is difficult to garner, right? So I'm going to be going through my philosophy books here, and there is no real order to these things as I look around all my books to make sure I didn't miss something. Inevitably, there will be things missed out. But the first here, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. This is a fairly new addition to my collection, and it is something that I do plan to end up actually doing a read-along for over on my personal channel. Marcus Aurelius, this is a classic Stoic text. Meditations is Marcus Aurelius' private book of reflections, written over a series of years in far-flung places as he led the Romans in military campaigns, quashed revolts, and dealt with other tribulations of governing the empire. It is best described as a spiritual journal, containing a record of Marcus's philosophical exercises. The book is interesting in an example of Stoic thought and is valuable for historic reasons as a document of the inner life of a remarkable Roman emperor. It remains compelling, however, because it bears witness to a profound journey of human spirit and speaks out across millennia about perennial human problems. This is a book that I have not read cover to cover, but I have obviously read excerpts of along philosophical journeys, and also just sitting down with it to read. I am not sure exactly how I'm going to break it down, because there's a lot of things going on in here, and it's got an interesting sort of format. But again, Stoicism is something in which I am extremely interested, and Marcus Aurelius's Meditations is an example of a text often used by Sam Harris, and especially if you saw the series of debates that Sam Harris did with Jordan Peterson. He often cited Marcus Aurelius's Meditations as a book that he was able to point to as being incredibly spiritually profound without having to be ultimately perfect, without having to be, it is something to which Sam Harris can always look when he needs guidance, but he doesn't have to say, okay, this is word for word as I must act. And that is one of the arguments that Sam Harris has against religions. Basically, this is the way I sum that argument up, is that if you want to look at your religious text and say, yes, it means what it says, but it does not mean it in a literal way. Because one of the ways that atheists are often criticized is that people say, you don't have to read this so literally. this is a religious text. It is a fabric of being type text. You don't have to take it word for word literal, and that's fine if that's the way you want to lead your religion. But the question falls to you. If you are not to take it word for word, why not? Right? So along those lines, the next book, Sam Harris, The Moral Landscape, is a book in which he does address religion and belief. And this is another book that I have not read cover to cover, but I am familiar with most of the arguments herein because I have watched basically every public talk that Sam Harris has ever given. This is another one that I do hope to, at some point, break down either on my personal channel. I'm thinking of creating an atheist channel just so that I don't have to put that stuff on my personal channel. Have a little bit of a dichotomy there so that it's not off-putting to people, and so that there is a break between that type of thought and the other stuff that I do, because it's not that I worry about being too abrasive to anyone, but I think that there are always inroads to be had between conversations, if that makes any sense at all. So while and whereas seeing Sam Harris, The Moral Landscape, pop up in someone's feed might make them auto unsubscribe, the fact that they would be willing to take the journey with me through other things might incline someone to eventually at least entertain the ideas that Sam Harris describes in his books. Next on the list, Free Will, a book that I have read. It is pretty profound. It was something that I was familiar with a lot of the... I remain, I think, a compatibilist. I think that's what it's called. Sort of like Daniel Dennett does, where basically my belief is that, yeah, we have free will. It just depends on how you define it. Though we are not... But the question remains, if you have free will, but you never think to take a hockey stick onto a football field during the game, are you really having all that free will? Because you can do a lot of damage on a football field with a hockey stick. So what rules are you playing by? Did it ever occur to you? So a lot of the question around free will and whether or not we actually have free will comes down to, what does free will mean? Sam Harris contends that free will means just that, free will. So no, we don't, because many of the things that we are led to do in life, we don't have the option of 100 things. There are only available to us 50 things because of the way we've been raised, because of the time at which we were born. X, Y, Z, A, B, C, all of these reasons, we don't ultimately have free will. We have a limited will, which Daniel Dennett, if I'm understanding this correctly, which Daniel Dennett says, no, that is free will. Just because you are not privy to other options does not mean that they are not available to you. If you had some spurt of genius while living in the 1400s and conceptualized a cell phone and were able to make it, then you would be able to make it. It's just being limited in the confines of your reality does not mean that your will itself is limited, whereas Sam Harris contends that yes, it is. But this was, I'll just flip to a random quote and we'll see what it's about here. Random highlight. What have we got here? Consider what it would take to actually have free will. You would need to be aware of all the factors that determine your thoughts and actions. That's another thing that Sam Harris says. We do not control our own thoughts, but we control them as much as anyone does. Anyway, you would need to be aware of all the factors that determine your thoughts and actions, and you would need to have complete control over those factors. But there is a paradox here that vitiates the very notion of freedom. That's a new word for me, although I did already highlight it, so it's apparently not that new. For what would influence the influences? More influences? None of these adventitious mental states are the real you. None of these adventitious mental states are the real you. You are not controlling the storm. You are lost in it. You are not lost in it. You are the storm. So again, that is sort of what Sam Harris is really arguing there. The next on this list, I include this here because I think it's a safe place in the collection to include it. The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Frederick Ingles. And unlike most communists, I have read this. And it is a stunning work of literature. One of my favorite opening lines of all time. Where are we here? A specter is haunting Europe. The specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Say what you will about him, Karl Marx was able to pen one hell of a line. And there's a lot of stunning quotes in here. Actually, extremely short. You're looking at a document that is excluding the prefaces. You're looking at a document that spans page 16 to page 58, right? And I mean, you're not looking at a whole lot. But along these same lines, the portable Karl Marx. This is something that I have not read. It has early writings, documents, letters, and reminiscences, Manifesto of the Communist Party, obviously, political writings, all these sorts of things. It is something that is interesting to have around. Karl Marx, look, I'm not going to disparage the guy too much. He's someone to whom these arguments may not have been original, but were new, if that makes any sense. He's someone who is extremely well-lettered and interesting to read. It is difficult for me to get through an entire work. I find, obviously, like many people, his thoughts are more easily digestible in nugget quotes from Marx through someone else explicating things. But that's because he was German, right? I mean, that's all that needs to be said there. The next book was gifted to me by a woman I was sleeping with. It is called How to Make a Human Being. And because of the title, I shat my pants. But it is an interesting... I have not read it. It is something that... So I recently had a series on the channel, Lincoln in the Bardo. And the nonfiction parts of the Lincoln in the Bardo book remind me a lot of the setup to this. This is a book that is... so it's going to be backwards, so you're not going to be able to really read anything. But it's set up by numbers, by a quote, a numbered quote, and then a fact. Everything has little facts underneath it. It's a very interesting setup for a book. It is a lot to take in. This is How to Make a Human Being, a Body of Evidence by Christopher Potter. It does look like something I would like to get around to at some point. On consciousness, matter greater than meat, on things, on time, evidence against the existence of an external world, evidence of the existence of an external world, what is science, nothing, something, everything. A lot of provocative chapter names. Something I'm going to get to at some point in time. The next book, so I have gone into fairly great length on this channel about how a lot of my education has been piecemeal and has been picked up as I was able to pick it up. There have been a lot of holes in my education because I did not have the money to continue education. I did not have the place in my life for education. But during those times, I would often pick up books to try to carry me through philosophically, psychologically, educationally, all of these types of things. In fact, one of the last things I actually picked up in my reading life was literature. Maybe ironically, considering the nature of this channel. But one of the things I was often picking up because it was so interesting to me and it was presented in a way that was digestible for me were these little, this is called Essential Philosophy, Everything You Need to Understand the World's Greatest Thinkers. Books like this that have just Chapter 18 of Psychology, Chapter 16, A Modern and Postmodern Philosophers, The American Transcendentalists, things where, so this was all pre-Wikipedia. This was all pre-internet really being a thing. So we're talking, a lot of the holes in my education happened from 04 through 08. A lot of semesters I had to take off, years that I had to take off, things like that. And when you are stuck in that, so I don't know that I have depression, but I definitely have depressive episodes in which I completely fall off the face of things. I completely disappear. I completely lose motivation, things like that. And one of the things that would get me through is being able to finish some type of reading. And in this, the chapters are simple enough, and they're not terribly long, that I was able to read long enough to digest something, to get something, and to have a new scope through which I could see things for a day or two. You read about transcendentalists for one night, you try it the next day for a little bit, and it's different. It's a different way to look at things. You think about utilitarianism, you read about it for a night, you try it the next day for a little bit, and it's something else to do. You read about nihilism, you try it for a day, and you might not have the next day. But anyway, that is one of the things that really helped me sort of get through things and sort of have a motivation to keep going, is at least having these little tastes of something educational, something for the old noggin. Claire Maxwell Hudson, Massage, the Ultimate Illustrated Guide. That's not philosophy, but we're not throwing it away. The Art of War by Sun Tzu. This was, I read this cover to cover when I was in grad school. I did not end up taking as much of it with me as I would like. I doubt anyone does on a first read, but if you have not read, so one of the things that I really tried to dedicate myself to doing in grad school was reading anything and applying it to what I wanted. So for example, when I was reading through The Art of War, I was trying to become a better writer. So I thought, okay, what are we doing here? With The Art of War, you have you and an enemy. So what are we talking about when you, the writer, the enemy, resistance. How do we defeat resistance? Here's 300 pages on how. You, the author, the enemy, your audience. How do we pull one over on the audience? Here's 300 pages on how. There's one more plane to that I had sort of made my way through. There's the author versus himself, there's the author versus the audience, and there's the author versus the craft. There's the writer versus learning the craft. So how do you attack what it means to learn the craft? So how do you attack Hemingway? How do you attack this greater canon of American letters? How do you attack poetry? What does it mean to write a short story? Well, when you're writing a short story, in a position of this sort, even though the enemy should offer us an attractive bait, what is the attractive bait? The attractive bait might be cliche. It sure is easy to get away with a cliche. That's an attractive bait. It will be advisable not to stir forth. Don't use that cliche, but rather to retreat. Go back. What was it that made you want to use the cliche? You put yourself in position to say the cliche. The car peeled out. No. So go all the way back. Though your character driving the car might have been angry, don't peel out. maybe he throws it into the wrong gear instead and backs up real quick. That gets you out of cliche. It presents another problem in your text. So that's another way that you use a text like this. That was one of the things that I really concentrated on in grad school. And eventually, someday, if I don't die an untimely death and I get to retire at some point, or I go full-time on YouTube, I'm going to go back and do the art of war for writers and do explicate in all three of those ways. The author versus himself, the author versus the craft, the author versus the audience. The next two books, The Right Thing to Do, Basic Readings in Moral Philosophy by James Rachel's, 4th edition by Stuart Rachel's, and Elements of Moral Philosophy by James Rachel's, 5th edition by Stuart Rachel's. These were two books that I had for a class in community college. Now, I had this class in community college, and it was extremely interesting. But it's hard to pay attention in a class in community college that lasts from 12 to 1:30, and you have to be at work 20 minutes away at 2 o'clock. That said, I stuck in there, and I made it all the way through. It was an ethics class. But it was in this class that I really started to understand one of the great stereotypes of college. Anytime you have a philosophy course in college, there's going to be one guy that won't shut the fuck up, no matter what. You're talking about A, won't shut the fuck up. You're talking about B, won't shut the fuck up. You're talking about shutting the fuck up, won't shut the fuck up. Wants to talk about A and B. This was the class that I got to know that son of a bitch in. Sat right next to me. Very interesting class, though. The class was basically set up by moral conundrum. Basically, we'd have a reading, and I'm not going to lie to you, when I had the class, did almost zero of the readings. Was not a proud moment in Adrian's education. But we would walk into class and discuss a moral conundrum. One of the things that I really remember from that class, and this would have been 2006, so we're talking a long time ago, but I still remember the guy talked about, one day the class was about lottery tickets, moral or immoral. I've always been of the thought that they're kind of, not that they're immoral, but I don't want to do it because, say you buy one a day. Well, it's just $1. It's $365 a year. That's $3,650 in a decade. Where could your money be instead of in these little pieces of trash? Like, that's not even toilet paper. That is worth less than toilet paper. Toilet paper, you gotta have for certain reasons. These anonymous little tickets, you don't. But he said, his case, the professor's case, not the guy who won't shut the fuck up, the professor's case was that no, a lottery ticket is one of the best investments you can make because it costs $1. You give $1, and no, you're not going to win money. You're not. Someone does. So for them, that gamble was obviously worth it. But you're not going to. However, that ticket is worth a philosophical lesson. Worth the philosophical lesson of, who are you going to help? Who are you going to help when you get that money? Mom, yeah. My siblings, sure. What about that bitch at work? You know the one. You know that bitch. Would you stop by and give her 10 grand? Just to see the look on her face? Because she hates you too. and her whole life is turned upside down at that moment. So that's worth it for that. It's worth it for that on a sort of religious and spiritual text, because in that moment where you're contemplating what would you do if you won all this money, you're a very forgiving person. It's also a math lesson. $1 million. If I had just $1 million, what could I do with $1 million? Well, I'd pay the house off. I'd buy that house at the end of the block and kick that son of a bitch out because I can't stand his dog. You go through all these math lessons. Plus, it is $1 that you spent for hours of entertainment. That was his case on the moral grounds of a lottery ticket. Next is a book that it sort of should embarrass me through some of my philosophical wanderings on the channel that I have not read, but I've tried. Thus Spake Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche. This is a beast. If you have not read it, you might not, because you start reading it. You start reading it, and you get 3 pages in, and he's already said so much weird shit, you forgot where you started. So then you go back a couple paragraphs and realize, I don't remember this at all. But yeah, I should, at some point, read Thus Spake Zarathustra, because I owe it to myself. The next 2 books, I am 35 years old. I've had these books for about 20 years. I've had these books, maybe longer than that. Believe it or not, at times in my young life, I was thought of as gifted. I was thought of as one of these kids who's really going to get ahead in life. We see how that panned out. I was thought of as one of these kids that really understands things. Other times in my life, my teachers hated me, and I was seen as a dolt. This is the quandary of life, I suppose. But one of the things that I was interested in middle school, and I had a teacher my sophomore year in high school who was a history teacher, but really sort of stoked the fires of this, is the Tao of Physics and Taoism. I've had these books since the late 90s, early aughts. I've read neither of them. But I have jumped around in them. And look, I don't think when I very first got these books I would have been capable of reading them. It was something that I would read a paragraph or 2 from and then just go. But yeah, there's something that... Jesus Christ. I have lived in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different apartments, 8 or 9 different apartments, plus my parents' house. These books have followed me around all that time. I owe it to them at some point to read them, to maybe run a highlighter over these goddamn pages at some point. But those... The Tao of Physics and Taoism. Is it unfair to consider those philosophy? Should that be in the religious texts? It says philosophy right there. That mentions philosophy on the cover of one and mysticism on the cover of the other. We're fine. We're fine. Nothing racist here. The next book is a book that I would not have the heart to highlight, so I don't have the heart to read it. I believe in books as tools, not as heirlooms. That said, every once in a while, I've got an older book, and I'm not going to screw with it. This is one on Man in the Universe by Aristotle. This was printed in 1943. Metaphysics based on the translation of John Henry McMahon. Parts of Animals based on the translation of William Ogle. Nicomachean Ethics based on the translation of James E.C. Weldon. Politics based on the translation of Benjamin Jowett. Poetics, based on the translation of Samuel Henry Butcher. This is marked up. It is an old text. It is from a library. I would not have the heart myself to run a highlighter through it. But it is interesting to go through all of the, you can tell that it was probably marked up in the 80s or 90s, because it's just the big words that are highlighted. It's not the actual, what it means. It's not the actual argument. This is the way that I was taught in school. If you don't know a word, highlight it, because it must be a vocabulary word, and then you go learn the vocabulary word. Don't highlight what it actually means in the text. Just highlight the vocabulary word. The next book was gifted to me by a woman I was sleeping with, and it almost made me shit my pants. It's called Grammars of Creation. I don't know what the hell you were thinking. By George Steiner. And it was something that I had absolutely no interest in at the time. Had no idea what this guy was on about. I read 20 pages and I was like, okay, that's it. I'm done. I think this is from, I think I was gifted this in 06, 07 maybe. No. 05. 05, because the place I was at. But now, reading the jacket, quote, "We have no more beginnings," unquote. George Steiner begins in this, his most radical book to date, a far-reaching exploration of the idea of creation in Western thought, literature, religion, and history. This volume can fairly be called a magnum opus. He reflects on the different ways we have of talking about beginnings, on the core tiredness that pervades our end of the millennium spirit, and on the changing grammar of our discussions about the end of Western art and culture. With this well-known elegance of style and intellectual range, Steiner probes deeply into the driving forces of the human spirit and our perception of Western civilization's lengthening afternoon shadows, roaming across topics as diverse as the Hebrew Bible, the history of science and mathematics, the ontology of Heidegger, the poetry of Paul Celan. Steiner examines how the 20th century has placed in doubt the rationale and credibility of a future tense. This now reeks of the hauntology spirit that has overwhelmed me of late, and I don't see a single hint about hauntology in it. So it would be great for me, and this was published originally in 90, originating in the Gifford Lectures of 1990 from George Steiner. Hauntology, I believe, is a philosophical movement by Derrida that goes back to the mid-80s, I think. I am very shady on the origins of it. So these being from 90, if they were spawned parallel to hauntology without knowledge of hauntology, that would be something super special to be able to read while learning about hauntology as well. Learning about hauntology as something original, and this Grammars of Creation as a parallel original. Where do the thought processes diverge, and where do they clash? The next is Existentialism is a Humanism by Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean-Paul. It was to correct common misconceptions about his thought that Sartre accepted an invitation to speak on October 29, 1945, at the Club Maintenant in Paris. The unstated objective of his lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, was to expound his philosophy as a form of existentialism, a term much bandied about in the press at the same time. Sartre asserted that existentialism was essentially a doctrine for philosophers, although, ironically, he was about to make it accessible to a general audience. The published text of his lecture quickly became one of the Bibles of existentialism and made Sartre an international celebrity. Existentialism is something that is quite ephemeral to me. I am not sure I understand it, because the parts about it that I think I understand are super not interesting, and people sort of tout this thought process of existentialism as the end-all be-all. So I'm just not sure I really get it. So this being what it was, one of his primary thrusts at the explication of existentialism, makes me want to read it next. Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill. This is something that I owe to myself to read. They are arguments of utilitarianism that I often cite myself, and it makes me want to know the thought process intimately. It makes me want to be familiar with the foundational texts of that. This being the opening paragraph. There are few circumstances among those which make up the present condition of human knowledge more unlike that might have been expected, or more significant of the backward state in which speculation on the most important subjects still lingers, than the little progress which has been made in the decision of the controversy respecting the criterion of right and wrong. That's a long way to say, we bitch back and forth about what is actually right and what is actually wrong, and we don't ever get anywhere. From the dawn of philosophy, the question concerning the summum bonum, or what is the state of what is the same thing concerning the foundation of morality, has been accounted the main problem in speculative thought, has occupied the most gifted intellects, and divided them into sects and schools, carrying on a vigorous warfare against one another. And after more than 2,000 years, the same discussions continue. Philosophers are still ranged under the same contending banners, and neither thinkers nor mankind at large seem nearer to being unanimous on the subject than with the youth Socrates listened to the old Protagoras, and asserted, if Plato's dialogue be grounded on real conversation, the theory of utilitarianism against the popular morality of the so-called sophist. Right? Jesus. Old John Stuart didn't make it very interesting. The next I have is The Poverty of Philosophy by Karl Marx. What better to have in a collection of philosophical texts than something called The Poverty of Philosophy? First published in French as Les Miserables de la Philosophie, Marx's The Poverty of Philosophy, 1847, was composed during his years in Brussels, when he was developing his economic views and through confrontations with chief leaders of the working class movement, establishing his intellectual standing. Well, there's irony. Marx establishing his thoughts through confrontations. Anyway, the next I have is Pathways in Philosophy. I bought this from a store called Hastings in St. Joe, where I would later work and later yet quit. This is from Oxford University Press. This was obviously a textbook for some class at Missouri Western State University, and it was turned in there. It was sold at $42.49. I think it was originally $84.95, and the actual publication price is $90. I think I got it for like $20 on clearance because I couldn't say no. This was a text that I haven't made my way through this almost at all, but I have bit and piece through it. I have looked, hey, where's nihilism in this? And I've looked that up, and hey, where's utilitarianism in this? And looked it up that way, things like that. But again, something that is nice to leaf through once in a while. The next one is another like that, one of those very first books I showed. This is Philosophy, The Great Thinkers by Philip Stokes. It's another one of these just, you got little, this is Epicurus, Isaac Newton. You've got little ditties on each of these actual philosophers. The man himself, the man, the myth, the legend, old Nasty Brow, Ernst Mach, So just a lot of different philosophers broken down into who they were, what they thought, what they wrote, who influenced them, things like that. That is interesting to, if you don't have a book like that, it really is nice in the way that what you do is you just sit down and you say, okay, I don't have a whole lot of time to learn philosophy, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit down and I'm going to read one of these every Monday, every Wednesday, and every Friday until I get through the fucking book. And what you do that way is it is sort of like taking your own class in philosophy. Obviously, there's going to be things you don't understand, things that are so dense and so hard to unpack that when you're learning them on your own, you really don't know if you understood it. Luckily, today, we have things like YouTube. So if you do get to Boethius and you don't understand what the hell is going on there, you can just YouTube it, and surely someone somewhere has made a video on the topic, and you get another extra little lesson. This is how a lot of people end up getting through some philosophy when they, like I couldn't afford it. I ended up going into English literature, and everything that I had. It was interesting. When I was an undergrad, I was 23 through 27 is when I was an undergrad. So I got my associates. I've told the story a million times on both channels, but it took me a long time to get my associates. And then I went up and I thought I was going to teach high school English. Got through some of those classes and realized, not me, man. I'm not cut out for this. And ended up switching to English literature instead, which is why I work overnights in retail. But it was stunning to me how so a lot of these kids that I was in class with, I mean, they were just kids that walked out of daddy's house and daddy sent them to college. And that had not been the road for me. And I'm not making fun of anybody. There are times in my life where I sure wish that had been my path, just to have gotten through things so much faster with so much less debt. But when it came time to write papers, a lot of these kids had nothing in their brains, nothing to write from, nothing to write with, nothing to bounce ideas off of. And that is you want to talk about poverty of philosophy. When you don't have a philosophy to start with, you don't understand what philosophy is. You don't have a life philosophy. What are you writing papers for? What are you writing papers on? It doesn't matter, So having had all of these things, don't get me wrong, I'm sure it didn't make my papers any better or more interesting to read for my professors, but it was certainly I wasn't just waving my knife in the air. I had a stone to sharpen it on, When I was writing those papers, I was sharpening my knife on those stones, versus just waving your knife in the air and hoping it gets sharper. To this day, it's one of the things, like, I was so taken aback when one of my classes wasn't advanced composition, which was what I was paying to take. What it was Feminism 101. At that point, all those kids in that class were just being indoctrinated. They weren't bouncing ideas off of anything. They had an inflow of someone's opinion on something and an outflow of her opinion onto papers. And I know that because we had to read everybody else's papers. We had to give feedback on people's papers. And all it was, I swear to God, I could have sat down on Monday and written every word that came out of her mouth, taking notes. And then on Wednesday, when we had to give rough drafts, had to exchange rough drafts, I could have just gone through with a checklist, you know, and that's indoctrination, you know. Anyway, it is maybe fitting that this is the last book in this portion of my philosophy text, the philosophy portion of my, what the hell is that, of my bookshelf tour. This was, I graduated high school in 2004. When do you graduate? You graduate going into the summer. So, graduate, what, in May? In June, I was promoted to management so graduate in May, promoted to management in June. August, I was on overnights. I was promoted to the overnight guy. Late August, mid-August, I started college at a community college. All of my classes, I would wake up at 8, go to work at 10, get to class at 7, be at class until 11. One of the casualties of that semester for me was my very first philosophy course. I have still not gone back through this book. This is a trip. This is a poem that I wrote. Look at that terrible handwriting. Jesus Christ. Jesus. And I did not take well to overnights at that point. And basically it was sunk cost. My classes that semester were sunk cost because I got nothing out of them. I was so dead all the time. I remember that first semester, the end of the semester, so you're talking December, I was driving from work to school. Icy, snowy, 9 degrees outside, who knows? And you're falling asleep and you're waking up and it's 9 degrees out, so you roll the window down and you turn the stereo up because you got to stay awake, baby. And I still pass through this red light every once in a while. That morning, I guess I didn't roll the window down. I woke up driving. I woke up at a red light to the sound of a horn. And when I opened my eyes, all my windows were fogged. I have no idea to this day how long I was asleep at that stoplight. I have no idea. I am so lucky that my foot stayed on that brake. Just terrifying, right? But yeah, like I say, this class was one of the casualties of trying to do that and trying to do that in that way. But that is the last philosophical text, I believe, that I have on this portion of my bookshelf tour. Again, I would love to have you back tomorrow for another video on this channel. I would love to have you on my personal channel, linked below in the comment section, pinned comment below. Just click on my little face down there and follow me over to that channel. Yeah, this has been weird. This has been a wild one. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to break up all of my bookshelf in order to tour it, but it's been an interesting beginning so far, and it is sort of, I have way too many books that I haven't read. Am I the only one that's that way? Please tell me below if you too have way too many books that you have and you haven't read. Because every time I'm doing this, every time I'm looking over at my shelves now, I'm realizing how few books I have that I have read, and it's embarrassing, because why do I keep spending money on these things if I'm not reading the ones I've got? So yeah, I'll see you.